Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 810. Necrotic Sovereign 1. The temperature in the dining hall seemed to plummet as my words hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Valen's wine glass froze halfway to his lips, his gray eyes sharpening with the kind of dangerous intensity that had made him the most feared ruler on the continent. Beside him, Camilla's face went pale, her diplomatic composure cracking under the weight of implications that struck at the heart of their most carefully guarded secret. "You know nothing about Rin," Valen said with quiet menace that made the enchanted chandeliers flicker overhead. "Nothing at all." I felt Stella tense beside me, her enhanced senses picking up on the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, even if she didn't understand the full context. Without thinking, I reached over and gently covered her ears, my enhanced reflexes moving faster than conscious thought as I sensed the conversation about to take a much darker turn. "I know more than you think," I replied, evenly maintaining eye contact with Valen despite the waves of barely controlled power radiating from his position. "I know what's been growing inside her. I know why the seals are failing." Valen's eyes suddenly snapped to Jean, realization dawning across his features like a dark storm. His expression shifted from surprise to something approaching betrayal as he processed who could have possibly revealed such closely guarded information. "Jean," he said with dangerous quiet, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and paternal disappointment. "You told him." Jin's face went pale, his diplomatic composure cracking under the sudden weight of his father's accusatory stare. "Father, You told him about your sister," Valen continued with mounting fury, his power beginning to fluctuate in response to the emotional betrayal. "About the seals. About dangers that could destroy our entire kingdom if they became public knowledge." "Seals?" Jin's voice carried genuine confusion, his diplomatic training clearly struggling to process information that his parents had never shared with him. Valen's jaw tightened dangerously, his warrior's instincts clearly recognizing the threat that came from having carefully maintained secrets exposed in front of witnesses. "This conversation is over." "No," I said firmly, my own power beginning to respond to the growing tension in the room. "It's just beginning. Rin is your daughter and she's in danger. I can help her." "Help her?" Valen's laugh held no humor whatsoever, the sound carrying years of desperate frustration and impossible choices. "You think you can help her? You have no idea what we're dealing with, boy. No conception of the forces involved or the risks we face every single day." The formal dining atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of charged tension that preceded either breakthrough understanding or devastating conflict. Callie's hand had moved instinctively toward her weapon, while Jean looked between his parents and me with growing alarm at revelations that were clearly reshaping his understanding of his family's situation. "Then explain it to me," I said with genuine request for information. "Help me understand what you've been dealing with." "Understand?" Valen's voice rose slightly, his careful royal composure beginning to fray under emotional pressure that had been building for years. "You want to understand? My daughter, my 17-year-old daughter, has been sealed beneath this palace for the past 3 years because the power growing inside her threatens to tear reality apart if it's ever released." Camilla flinched at the brutal honesty, tears beginning to gather in her eyes as her husband voiced truths they had never spoken aloud in front of others. "Every day those seals weaken," Valen continued with mounting intensity. "Every day she grows stronger, and every day I have to face the possibility that tomorrow might be the day she breaks free and accidentally destroys everyone I've sworn to protect." His gray eyes fixed on Stella, whose ears I was still protectively covering, and his expression grew even more grimly determined. "Tell me, Arthur," he said with dangerous quiet, "if it was your daughter sitting there, if Stella carried power that could kill millions of innocent people through no fault of her own, would you trust some stranger who claimed he could fix everything? Would you risk her life and the lives of everyone else on promises from someone who doesn't truly understand the situation?" The parallel hit like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the full weight of what Valen had been carrying. Looking at Stella's concerned face, I tried to imagine making the kinds of impossible choices that had defined Valen's existence for the past several years. But even as I processed his perspective, Luna's voice cut through my thoughts with urgent warning. "Arthur," she said with sharp concern that made my enhanced senses snap to immediate alertness, "something's wrong with his mana flow. The patterns are becoming increasingly erratic. He's showing signs of deviation." Mana deviation. The dangerous condition that could occur when a mage's emotional state became so unstable that it began affecting their magical control on a fundamental level. In someone of Valen's power level, such a breakdown could have catastrophic consequences for everyone in the immediate vicinity. "How severe?" I asked through our mental link while maintaining outward focus on the increasingly volatile conversation. "Escalating rapidly," Luna replied with growing alarm. His power is responding to his emotional state instead of his conscious will. The realization added a new dimension of urgency to an already critical situation. Valen wasn't just emotionally compromised. He was becoming magically unstable in ways that threatened everyone present. I understand your position, I said, carefully lowering my voice in an attempt to defuse some of the building tension. But I've seen what Rin is dealing with. I know the specific type of corruption that's affecting her, and I have techniques that can address it safely. Safely? Valen's voice cracked like a whip, his power flaring in response to emotions that were clearly spiraling beyond his control. There is nothing safe about Rin's condition. Nothing safe about power that grows exponentially without limit. Nothing safe about a 17-year-old girl who could reshape continents if she ever lost control. Which is exactly why she needs help, I pressed, sensing that this might be my last chance to reach him before the situation deteriorated completely. Containing power like that indefinitely isn't sustainable. Eventually those seals will fail whether we act or not. And when they do, Valen said with brutal finality that spoke to years of planning for the worst-case scenario, I will do what must be done to protect my people. Even if it means... He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone present understood what he meant. The king of the Western continent had already mentally prepared himself to kill his own daughter, if necessary, to prevent a catastrophe that could devastate millions of innocent lives. There's another way, I said with absolute conviction, my own power beginning to respond to the increasingly unstable magical environment. I've developed techniques specifically designed to handle corruption at this level. I can save her without putting anyone else at risk. Techniques you learned fighting demons, Valen said with dismissive contempt that cut through any remaining diplomatic pretense. Combat experience against entities that bear no resemblance to what we're dealing with here. Experience that taught me how to purify corruption that goes deeper than conventional healing can reach, I countered, my voice hardening as I realized that rational argument was rapidly becoming impossible. Through our mental link, Luna's warnings grew more urgent. His deviation is accelerating. The emotional trauma of discussing his daughter is overwhelming his magical control. Arthur, if he loses containment completely. I could feel it too now. The way Valen's power was beginning to fluctuate, wildly responding to psychological pressure instead of conscious direction. The man who had built his reputation on absolute self-control was approaching a breakdown that could level the entire palace. You know nothing about what we've tried, Valen snarled, his composure finally cracking completely as years of suppressed desperation and fury boiled over. Nothing about the specialists we've consulted, the techniques we've attempted, the sacrifices we've made trying to find alternatives. Then let me show you something new, I said desperately, my enhanced senses picking up dangerous fluctuations in the magical field surrounding us. Let me prove that there are options you haven't considered. Options? Valen's laugh held the edge of hysteria, his power now openly crackling around him like barely contained lightning. The only option that matters is protecting the people who depend on me. Jean, his future, the millions of subjects who trust me to keep them safe from threats they can't even imagine. His gray eyes blazed with the kind of fanatic intensity that spoke to a man who had been pushed far beyond his emotional limits. You have no right, he said with deadly quiet that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. No right to come into my kingdom, into my home, and tell me how to handle my family's tragedy. No right to second-guess decisions you could never understand. No right to offer false hope about problems that have no solutions. The magical pressure in the room reached critical levels as Valen's power responded to his emotional state without any conscious control. Plates began to rattle on the table, while the enchanted lighting flickered erratically in response to the chaotic energy building around us. And no right, Valen finished with absolute hostility that marked the end of any possibility for diplomatic resolution to threaten everything I've built by interfering with matters beyond your comprehension. The air itself seemed to catch fire as the king of the Western continent finally abandoned all pretense of civil discourse, his mid-radiant rank power blazing to full intensity as he prepared to eliminate what he now clearly saw as an unacceptable threat to his kingdom's security. The battle was about to begin. Chapter 8:11. Necrotic Sovereign 2. I wasn't expecting this confrontation to be easy. There was a reason I had initially wanted to come here alone after all. I knew that revealing my knowledge of Rin would inevitably lead to conflict with her parents. But I had still brought Stella with me for two very specific reasons. First, I could trust Jean and Callie completely to protect her if things went badly. Their loyalty and capability were beyond question, making them the perfect guardians for someone so precious to me. Daddy? Stella asked, concern seeping into her voice as she sensed the dangerous tension building around us. Without hesitation, I reached over and gently touched my fingertips to her forehead, willing her into peaceful sleep with carefully controlled mana. Her small body relaxed immediately as consciousness faded, her head tilting to rest against my shoulder with the absolute trust that only a child could show. Jean, Callie, I said calmly, carefully transferring Stella's sleeping form to their protective care. Take care of her. Both of them nodded with grim understanding, Callie's arms wrapping around Stella with surprising gentleness, while Jean positioned himself to shield them both from whatever was about to unfold. Their combined auras created a defensive barrier that would discourage any stray magical effects from reaching her. Then I looked back at Valen and calmly stood up, my movements deliberate and unhurried despite the crackling tension that filled the air around us. I yawned slightly, a gesture of casual dismissal that I knew would infuriate him further, just as his manner rushed toward me with killing intent. His gray eyes glinted with the dangerous light of someone who had finally abandoned all restraint. "Stop wasting time," I said as I erected a barrier of ambient mana, effortlessly diverting and nullifying his attack before it could reach me. "If you want a fight, then a fight is what you'll have, Valen Ashbluff. You have grown arrogant, Arthur Nightingale," Valen snarled as he rose from his chair, mana pressure increasing exponentially as he fell deeper into deviation. The very air around him began to distort under the weight of his barely controlled power. "Arrogant?" I smirked, meeting his furious gaze with calm confidence. Perhaps it did look like arrogance from his perspective. A 23-year-old who hadn't even officially reached Radiant rank challenging someone who had spent 2 decades mastering that level of power. The current rank 1 in the world facing down someone who should have been hopelessly outclassed. However, it wasn't arrogance at all. It was simple calculation based on capabilities he couldn't possibly understand. Instantly I felt space around him warp as he launched forward with a devastating punch, his enhanced speed creating sonic booms that shattered the remaining dinnerware. "Seriously doing this here?" I thought with mild annoyance as I raised my arm in response. In that split second I activated everything. Soul resonance flooded my system, granting me mythic body enhancement and soul vision that let me perceive the true flow of his attacks. Lucent harmony synchronized my magical channels for optimal efficiency. Seraphim's embrace wrapped me in protective energy that made my skin shine with subtle divine radiance. And then I simply caught his punch. My fingers closed around his fist with casual ease, stopping what should have been a continent-shaking blow, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. The shock that flashed across Valen's features was almost worth the entire confrontation. I said, "Don't waste my time, Valen," I said calmly, using my grip on his fist to pull him toward me. He responded by throwing another punch with his free hand, this one channeling the full power of his deep dark affinity. Shadows and void energy that could tear through conventional defenses like paper. The attack connected solidly with my chest, only to dissipate harmlessly against my ancient-grade armor and mythic body enhancement. As his momentum carried him close enough, my fingers touched his chest with deceptive gentleness. Fifth movement of my grade 5 close quarters combat art. 1-inch punch. I closed my fist while pushing forward in a motion that looked almost leisurely, allowing my knuckles to connect with his sternum in a burst of mana imbued with the perfect concept of explosive force delivery. The technique, refined through countless battles against marquee-level demons, transferred devastating power through the smallest possible movement. Valen's feet left the ground as he was launched backward, his body crashing through the manor's reinforced walls like they were made of paper. But before he could travel far, I warped space by controlling the ambient spatial mana around us, teleporting both of us away from the dining hall to a much more suitable location for this kind of confrontation. We materialized in the vast training grounds behind the palace. A space specifically designed to contain high-level magical combat with reinforced barriers and protective enchantments that could withstand Radiant rank battles without collateral damage to the surrounding city. The second reason I had brought Stella became clear as I surveyed our new battlefield. I genuinely wasn't sure I could lose to someone like Valen anymore, regardless of his reputation or ranking. Valen picked himself up from the crater. His impact had created his royal attire torn and bloodied, but his eyes burning with even greater fury than before. For a moment he simply stared at me, processing what had just occurred. "You're a monster," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and horror as the full implications of our exchange became clear. "You haven't even reached Radiant rank officially, and yet I'm stronger than you," I finished with matter-of-fact certainty that carried no boast or arrogance. Simply acknowledgement of an observable reality. Valen's face contorted with rage at having his worst fears confirmed. Without another word he raised his hands and began channeling the kind of massive summoning that spoke to decades of necromantic mastery. The ground beneath his feet cracked and split as dark energy poured forth, multiple forms coalescing simultaneously in a display of power that made the very air tremble with ancient malevolence. First came his bone dragon. Bones erupting from the earth to form the massive skeletal structure of something that had once ruled the skies with absolute dominion. The creature materialized at easily 200 feet long, its hollow eye sockets blazing with unholy fire, while wing membranes of pure shadow stretched between finger bones that could crush buildings. But Valen wasn't finished. A second summoning circle blazed to life, and from it rode forth his Dullahan, a headless horseman mounted on a skeletal warhorse wreathed in spectral flames. The creature's missing head floated beside it, eyes burning with green fire, while it gripped a massive scythe that seemed to cut through reality itself with each movement. A third circle completed the summoning as Valen's Death Lord emerged. A towering figure in ancient plate armor that had been fused with bone and shadow. The creature stood 15 feet tall, wielding a greatsword that pulsed with necromantic energy, its hollow helm revealing nothing but darkness within. 3 legendary tier undead summons, each representing years of careful construction and binding rituals that had cost Valen pieces of his own soul to complete. This was the true power of the world's strongest necromantic ruler, displayed in all its terrifying glory. Impressive, I acknowledged, genuinely noting the exquisite craftsmanship that had gone into the creature's construction. Though I hope you won't mind if I match your summoning. I extended my hand, channeling necromantic energy that had been refined through battles against beings that made greater dragons look like hatchlings. Erebus, I called, and the Arch-Lich materialized beside me in a swirl of absolute darkness. But this wasn't the Erebus that Valen might have remembered from reports of my earlier capabilities. Years of enhancement and evolution had transformed my primary summon into something approaching a force of nature. His skeletal form now stood 12 feet tall, wrapped in robes that seemed to absorb light itself, while a crown of midnight metal rested upon his skull. Ancient runes covered every visible bone, pulsing with power that spoke to mastery over death itself. Valeria, I continued, and my bone symbiote flowed from my shadow to take her preferred humanoid form. A graceful figure of articulated bone and shadow that moved with predatory elegance. And Luna, I finished, smiling as my contracted Qilin chose to manifest in her favored appearance. A 14-year-old girl with silver hair and eyes that held the wisdom of millennia, her small form radiating power that made the air shimmer with rainbow light. Valen's expression grew increasingly grim as he processed the implications of what stood before him. 3 summons of unmistakably legendary caliber, each radiating power that rivaled his own dragon, controlled with casual ease by someone who shouldn't have possessed such capabilities. Still think this is about arrogance? I asked, conversationally, reaching toward the dimensional storage where my most prized possession waited. My fingers closed around a hilt that felt like perfectly balanced ice and fire combined, drawing forth the weapon that had become the symbol of my transformation from promising student to something beyond conventional classification. Nixthar emerged from its sheath like a piece of crystallized night sky, its legendary grade enchantments causing reality itself to bend slightly around the blade's edge. The sword appeared to be carved from darkness, given physical form, its surface reflecting no light while somehow remaining perfectly visible. Let me show you, I said as I settled into a combat stance that had been perfected against opponents who could reshape reality with their will alone, exactly what I learned during my time away. The legendary sword hummed with anticipation, its edgeless blade somehow sharper than anything conventional metallurgy could produce, while my assembled summons took their positions around me with the perfect coordination that came from countless battles fought together. Valen's bone dragon roared its challenge, the sound echoing across the training grounds like thunder from the underworld. But for the first time since our confrontation began, I saw uncertainty creep into the king's eyes as he truly understood what he was facing. This wasn't going to be the easy victory he had expected. Chapter 8:12. Necrotic Sovereign 3. The battle erupted with devastating intensity as our summons clashed across the training grounds. Valeria flowed back into my shadow, her bone symbiote form merging with my body to reinforce my physical capabilities, while Luna and Erebus engaged Valen's trio of legendary undead. The clash between ancient powers sent shockwaves through the reinforced barriers, the very air crackling with competing magical energies. Luna moved like liquid starlight, her small humanoid form belying the immense power she wielded as she intercepted Valen's massive bone dragon. The collision between Qilin and undead Drake sent ripples of force that cracked the training ground's foundations, rainbow light clashing against unholy fire in a display that would have been visible from orbit without the containment barriers. Meanwhile, Erebus engaged both the Dullahan and Death Lord simultaneously, his enhanced form weaving between scythe strikes and greatsword swings with supernatural grace. Dark magic met darker magic as the Arch-Lich demonstrated why he had earned his legendary classification through battles that had lasted centuries. But my attention remained fixed on Valen himself as twin daggers materialized in his hands, both weapons gleaming with the distinctive energy of deep dark affinity, enhanced by perfect dagger unity. The blades seemed to absorb light around them, creating distortions in space that spoke to their legendary grade enchantments. Without warning, Valen's hands blurred into motion and dozens of shadow-wreathed daggers filled the air around me. Each blade carried the full force of his mastery, while a 9-circle spell matrix blazed to life beneath his feet. I exhaled slowly, feeling time stretch as I raised Nixthar and brought it down in a perfect vertical arc. The blade's tip touched the ground with surgical precision as I activated one of my most refined techniques. Fourth movement of my Grade 6 art, Pond of Tranquility. The space around me became absolute stillness, a sphere of perfect negation that dominated the immediate battlefield. Every dagger struck the boundary and simply ceased to exist, their kinetic energy and magical enhancements unraveling like morning mist. The 9-circle spell collapsed in on itself, its carefully constructed matrices dissolving into harmless sparks. "You'll be fine handling the dragon, won't you, Luna?" I asked through our mental link while keeping my eyes fixed on Valen. "Of course," she replied with amused confidence, rainbow energy flaring, as she drove the massive undead back with contemptuous ease. "Take care of the king. Try not to break him too badly." Valen's eyes narrowed as he processed what had just occurred, his analytical mind working through the implications of seeing his strongest opening assault negated so effortlessly. "The martial king's blade," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Nixthar with the kind of recognition that spoke to deep historical knowledge. I wondered if the reports were accurate. I didn't respond immediately. Words felt unnecessary when the weapon in my hands spoke volumes about the level I had reached. Not all legendary-grade artifacts were created equal, and we both understood this fundamental truth. Valen's Black Heart artifact pulsed within his chest, providing him with vast reservoirs of mana to fuel his necromantic summons and shadow manipulation. It was a fearsome tool that had secured his position as one of the world's most dangerous rulers. But Nixthar existed in a different category entirely. The blade wasn't merely a weapon, it was a legacy of power that approached the threshold of mythical-grade classification. And Valen could sense the difference. "Let's finish this," I said, raising Nixthar as its surface began to emit that characteristic dark radiance. The air around us grew heavy with unspoken promises of devastation. Astral energy coated the blade created from my sword heart, but also boosted by my sword unity. Valen's lips curved into a grim smile as he spun his daggers, the weapons alive with astral energy that warped reality in their vicinity. "Agreed. I've wasted enough time trying to reason with you." He exploded into motion, becoming a blur of shadow and steel as he closed the distance between us. My enhanced reflexes tracked his approach, Nixthar rising instinctively to meet his assault. When our weapons collided, the impact sent shockwaves radiating outward that shattered the reinforced stone beneath our feet. Valen fought like the master warrior. He was his daggers creating intricate patterns of attack that tested every aspect of my defensive capabilities. Shadow-red strikes came from impossible angles, while spectral afterimages multiplied his apparent positions, forcing me to rely on soul vision to track his true location through the maze of deception. "You've improved significantly," Valen admitted between exchanges, his voice carrying grudging respect even as his attacks showed no mercy. "But raw power isn't enough to challenge someone who has spent decades perfecting their craft." "That blade chose me," I replied calmly, allowing Nixthar's resonant energy to flow through my movements. "And I'm finally beginning to understand why." I shifted to the offensive, Nixthar blazing through the air in precise arcs that carved through Valen's shadow constructs like they were made of morning mist. Each strike carried the weight of perfected technique, forcing him to give ground as his defensive formations crumbled under sustained assault. But Valen was far from finished. His shadow armor surged outward, manifesting as a tide of obsidian spikes that erupted from the ground in complex patterns designed to trap and impale. I countered by spinning Nixthar in tight defensive circles, the blade's edge unraveling his attacks at the conceptual level before they could reach me. "Impressive," Valen said, his tone growing more serious as he recognized the futility of conventional assault. "But you haven't faced the true extent of power." His mana signature began to shift, growing denser and more oppressive as he prepared something that made the very air tremble with anticipation. The shadows around him deepened while his 3 legendary summons began to glow with enhanced energy as their connection to their master strengthened. "You forced me to reveal techniques reserved for continental threats," Valen continued, his voice carrying notes of finality. "Domain expansion. Throne of the Eternal Necropolis." Reality twisted as Valen's domain exploded outward, transforming the training grounds into something from the deepest nightmares of the living. The sky turned the color of dried blood, while massive obsidian towers erupted from the earth, each one carved with the names of the dead and crowned with floating skulls that served as eternal sentinels. A great throne of black bone materialized behind Valen, its surface inscribed with necromantic runes that pulsed with malevolent power. Spectral armies marched in endless processions between the towers, their ethereal forms adding their strength to their king's reserves. The very ground became a necropolis with tombstones and mausoleums stretching to the horizon, each one representing a soul under Valen's dominion. Within this realm of death, his power amplified exponentially. His 3 summons grew larger and more terrible, while new undead began emerging from every shadow and crevice. This was the true might of the world's strongest necromantic ruler, displayed in all its terrifying glory. "This is my kingdom," Valen declared, his voice echoing from every surface as though the domain itself spoke with his authority. "Here death reigns supreme, and I am its absolute sovereign." The oppressive weight of his domain pressed against me from all directions, testing the limits of my mental fortitude. Lesser mages would have been crushed instantly by the sheer concentration of necromantic energy, their souls torn from their bodies to join the eternal army that served the Necropolis King. "Impressive," I admitted, my voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere of his necropolis with surprising clarity. "You've created something worthy of your reputation. But you're about to discover why some powers transcend even death itself." I raised Nixthar high, feeling the blade respond to my breakthrough with resonant energy that made the weapon sing with anticipation. The ancient script along its fuller began to glow with increasing intensity as I channeled everything I had learned into a single moment of perfect focus. "You've relied on your mastery over death to maintain dominance," I continued, my voice growing stronger as power flowed through me in waves. "But there are forces in this universe that even the eternal necropolis cannot contain." Valen's eyes widened as he sensed the shift in my energy signature, his instincts recognizing the approach of something that threatened the very foundations of his domain. His undead armies pressed closer while his 3 legendary summons abandoned their battles with my companions to converge on my position. But it was too late. Now I begin to manifest my own domain for the first time since my return to this world. Reality around me started to shift, responding to will and power that had been forged in battles against beings who could reshape entire dimensions. Domain expansion, I said quietly, my words carrying weight that made the necropolis itself tremble with uncertainty. Chapter 8:13. Necrotic Sovereign 4. A memory flashed through my mind as I felt my true domain preparing to manifest. The first time I had broken through to low immortal rank while fighting Jack Blazespout in the burning Avalon City. In that moment of triumph and desperation, I had simultaneously unlocked Mythweaver, my third and most complex gift. I had been so overwhelmed by the sheer scope of power that Mythweaver represented, so awed by its reality-altering capabilities, that my domain had been born purely from that single gift. A mistake born of naivety and inexperience, creating a flawed manifestation that relied on only one aspect of my true nature. That mistake would not happen again. Domain expansion, I said with quiet certainty, feeling the fundamental forces that defined my existence beginning to align in perfect harmony. Throne of Eternal Twilight. Everything about my development had been rooted in balance from the very beginning. Balance between my swordsmanship and spellcasting. Balance between my pure light and deep dark affinities. Balance between the three fundamental aspects that shaped all magical development. As such, this domain was born from the perfect synthesis of all three gifts, creating something that transcended the limitations of any single power source. Valen's throne of the Eternal Necropolis began to crack and fracture as my domain asserted its dominance over the battlefield. His realm of death and shadow found itself invaded by something that existed in the space between all conventional classifications. Neither pure light nor absolute darkness, but the perfect balance that connected all extremes. The obsidian towers of his necropolis remained, but they were now streaked with veins of pearl and silver that pulsed with gentle radiance. The blood-red sky shifted to the deep purple of eternal twilight, where neither day nor night held dominion. His throne of black bones sprouted crystalline growths that caught and reflected light that shouldn't have existed in a realm of the dead. And at the center of it all, I felt wings unfurling from my back. But these were not the wings of eclipse that I had grown accustomed to manifesting in combat. In my domain, touching the power that had been gifted to me by Goddess Akasha herself, the feathers weren't black with edges of light. They were gray. Pure, perfect gray that represented the ultimate nullification of all opposing forces. The color that existed between all colors, the power that broke every rule this world tried to impose on reality. A crown materialized upon my head. Not the golden circlet of divine authority or the obsidian diadem of shadow mastery, but a simple band of the same impossible gray that seemed to absorb and reflect everything simultaneously. Gray. The ultimate power that broke everything in this world. I could only access it within my domain, and even then my current strength limited how much of that transcendent force I could safely channel. But that limitation didn't matter. In my domain, I was invincible. Valen's eyes widened in genuine shock as he felt the full weight of my transformation pressing against his consciousness. His necropolis, which had seemed so absolute and overwhelming just moments before, now felt like a child's sand castle being gently dismantled by an incoming tide. Impossible, he breathed, his daggers trembling in hands that had never known uncertainty in magical combat. What are you? I didn't answer with words. Instead, I moved. The gray wings carried me forward with speed that transcended normal teleportation, allowing me to simply exist at Valen's location without bothering with the inconvenience of crossing the space between us. My sword came down in a perfect vertical arc, the first movement of my grade 6 art flowing through the blade with devastating precision. Godflash. Valen barely managed to cross his daggers in a defensive position before the strike connected, but the impact sent him crashing through 3 of his own obsidian towers. The structures crumbled to dust around him, their necromantic enchantments unraveling like morning mist before the inexorable advance of gray nullification. He rolled to his feet with the fluid grace of a master warrior, shadow armor flaring to maximum density as he prepared for sustained combat. But I was already there, having crossed the intervening distance through another effortless application of spatial displacement. Godflash. Absolute. This time my blade carved through his defensive formation like it was made of paper, the enhanced version of my technique carrying enough force to split the very air in its wake. Valen's shadow armor held for perhaps a microsecond before dissolving completely, leaving him vulnerable as my follow-up strike sent him tumbling across the fractured ground. You're not even trying, I observed calmly, my voice carrying across the transformed battlefield with casual authority. Is this really the extent of the world's strongest necromancer? Valen snarled, pushing himself upright as dark energy began to coalesce around him in increasingly desperate patterns. 9 circle spell matrices blazed to life beneath his feet while spectral reinforcements poured from every shadow in his crumbling domain. I responded by channeling my own 9-circle method, a technique I had developed during my training in the demon realm after absorbing Bahamut's dragon heart. The ancient dragon's magical essence had provided the foundation for understanding how to weave multiple complex spell structures, simultaneously creating magical constructs that rivaled the greatest achievements of Archmage-level casters. 9 circles of perfect gray energy formed around me, each one pulsing with the kind of balanced power that made Valen's necromantic workings look crude by comparison. The spell I was preparing didn't rely on any single magical school or affinity. Instead, it drew from the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. You want to see improvement? I asked, raising Nixthar as the 9-circle array reached completion. Let me show you what I learned fighting beings that could reshape dimensions. God Flash, Singularity. The third and most devastating variation of my grade 6 art's opening movement combined perfectly with the 9-circle spell matrix, creating an attack that existed at the intersection of physical technique and magical supremacy. Nixthar became a conduit for forces that operated beyond conventional understanding, its edgeless blade cutting through concepts as easily as matter. Valen's hastily constructed defenses lasted exactly as long as it took for my strike to reach them. His spell matrices collapsed, his spectral reinforcements were banished to whatever realm they had emerged from, and the man himself was sent flying across his own domain with enough force to crater the ground where he finally came to rest. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth as he struggled to rise, his legendary grade daggers now sporting hairline cracks that spoke to damage that should have been impossible to inflict on weapons of that caliber. This isn't possible, he gasped, his analytical mind clearly struggling to process what was happening to him. I'm mid-radiant rank. I'm the strongest necromancer in the world. How are you? Because rank is just a number, I interrupted, walking toward him with unhurried steps while my gray wings maintained their lazy rhythm. Because you've spent decades perfecting techniques within the system's limitations while I learned to break those limitations entirely. To demonstrate my point, I shifted to the second movement of my grade 6 art. Hollow Eclipse. The technique manifested as a sphere of absolute void that consumed everything within its radius, not destroying it but simply removing it from existence on a conceptual level. Part of Valen's domain simply ceased to be, leaving behind empty space that even his necromantic power couldn't fill. You see? I continued conversationally as he stared in horror at the gap in reality I had casually created. Your power operates within the rules. Mine transcends them. Valen's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, disbelief, growing desperation, and finally grim determination. If individual power isn't sufficient, he said through gritted teeth, his voice carrying the weight of absolute resolve, then I'll use everything at my disposal. He began channeling massive amounts of mana, his black heart artifact pulsing frantically in his chest as it fed him the energy reserves necessary for what he was attempting. The process was brutally inefficient, unsummoning his 3 legendary undead from their separate battles with Luna and Erebus, then immediately resummoning them within his domain. Domain battles separated the combatants from normal spacetime, making it impossible for his summons to simply travel here. Instead, he had to sever their existing manifestations and recreate them entirely, a process that would have drained a normal necromancer's mana reserves completely. But Valen was no ordinary necromancer, and his legendary grade artifact provided him with vast reservoirs of power to draw upon. Dark energy swirled around him as his 3 greatest creations began to materialize: the massive bone dragon, the spectral Dullahan, and the towering Death Lord. His power signature began to shift as he prepared to channel the combined might of all his contracted undead simultaneously. A technique that would either grant him the strength to challenge my dominance or destroy him in the attempt. Interesting, I mused, settling into a comfortable stance while Nixthar hummed with anticipation. Let's see what desperation can accomplish against the impossible. The final phase of our battle was about to begin. Chapter 814. Necrotic Sovereign 5. King Valen Ashbluff, the strongest necromancer in the world and current rank 1 among all rulers, stood amid the twilight ruins of his domain and felt something he had not experienced in over 2 decades of absolute dominance. Fear. Not the tactical concern of facing a dangerous opponent, nor the calculated wariness of political maneuvering. This was primal existential terror at witnessing power that operated beyond the fundamental laws he had spent his entire life mastering. Arthur Nightingale stood before him, gray wings spread in casual majesty, and Valen's enhanced senses screamed contradictory information that his analytical mind could not reconcile. The young man's mana signature registered as quasi-radiant rank. Powerful certainly, but still technically beneath Valen's own mid-radiant rank classification. Yet Arthur wielded 9-circle magic with effortless precision while simultaneously demonstrating sword techniques that showed perfect unity between weapon and wielder. Such capabilities should have been impossible for anyone below full radiant rank, requiring the kind of mana density and control that came only with complete mastery of one's chosen path. How? Valen whispered the question, escaping before he could stop it. You haven't even reached radiant rank. The system readings, the magical signatures, none of this should be possible. Arthur's response was a slight smile that carried no mockery, only patient understanding of forces that transcended conventional classification. The dark energy around Valen intensified as his 3 legendary summons fully materialized within the domain. His bone dragon spread wings that blotted out the twilight sky, while the Dullahan's spectral flames burned with renewed intensity. The Death Lord raised its massive greatsword, ancient runes along the blade pulsing with accumulated power from centuries of conquest. Shadow armor flowed across Valen's form like liquid darkness, the defensive technique reaching maximum density as it integrated with his domain's necromantic energy. His twin daggers blazed with perfect dagger unity, the weapons becoming extensions of his will, as he prepared to channel the combined might of everything he had built across decades of relentless advancement. If the natural order has become meaningless, Valen's snarled power crackling around him like controlled lightning, then I'll forge a new reality through absolute force. He attacked with everything he possessed. The bone dragon descended from above, its massive jaws wreathed in soulfire that could incinerate cities. The Dullahan charged from the left, its reality-cutting scythe carving spatial rifts with each swing. The Death Lord advanced from the right, its great sword trailing necromantic energy that withered the very air it passed through. Valen himself struck from the center, his daggers weaving patterns of destruction, while his domain's power amplified every movement. Shadow spikes erupted from the ground in complex formation, spectral armies materialized to provide supporting fire, and the very laws of his necropolis bent to facilitate his assault. It was an attack that could have leveled mountains, shattered armies, and broken the will of any conventional opponent. Arthur moved with fluid precision, his gray wings carrying him through the coordinated assault with minimal wasted motion. Nixthar swept in controlled arcs that deflected rather than destroyed, redirecting the bone dragon's bite away from him, while simultaneously batting aside the Dullahan's scythe and parrying the Death Lord's great sword. His movements were economical, almost gentle. He clearly possessed the power to shatter Valen's legendary summons entirely, but was deliberately holding back to avoid causing permanent damage. I don't want to hurt you unnecessarily, Arthur said, as he caught Valen's crossed daggers on Nixthar's edge, the weapons trembling under the strain of opposing forces. But you need to understand the difference in our capabilities. With a subtle twist of his wrist, Arthur sent Valen flying backward, the king's shadow armor absorbing most of the impact but failing to prevent him from crashing through one of his own obsidian towers. Your technique is flawless, Arthur continued, advancing at a measured pace while Valen's summons regrouped around their master. Your mastery over necromancy is genuinely impressive. But you're still operating within the system's limitations. To demonstrate, he raised Nixthar and executed his third movement with reduced intensity. Stellar Cascade. The controlled waterfall of cutting energy swept across the battlefield, but instead of erasing Valen's summons, it severed their connection to his mana. The bone dragon crashed to the ground as its animating force was disrupted, while the Dullahan and Death Lord froze in place, as their spectral flames guttered out. Not destroyed, simply powered down like complex machines that had been temporarily disconnected from their energy source. Valen staggered to his feet, his mind reeling from the precise way Arthur had neutralized legendary constructs without actually damaging them. The technical skill required for such controlled application of overwhelming force spoke to understanding that went far beyond raw power. His domain began to pulse with renewed energy as he prepared his ultimate technique, drawing power from every corner of his realm, while his artifact pushed beyond safe operational limits. The obsidian towers blazed with necromantic fire, while the throne of black bone behind him cracked and reformed into something larger and more terrible. Domain expansion. True throne of the eternal necropolis. Reality itself bent as Valen's enhanced domain asserted its dominance over the battlefield. This was beyond his normal manifestation. This was the technique he had reserved for threats to the Western continent itself, the power that could reshape the laws of life and death across entire kingdoms. The twilight that had invaded his realm was pushed back by waves of absolute darkness, while spectral armies numbering in the millions materialized from the spaces between heartbeats. The very concept of death became weaponized, turning the air itself into something that could drain life from any living being foolish enough to oppose the Necropolis King's will. For a moment, just a moment, Valen felt the familiar rush of absolute power that had defined his reign. This was the strength that had made him the world's strongest ruler, the force that could stand against continental threats and emerge victorious. Arthur looked at the enhanced domain, at the millions of spectral warriors, at the reality-warping necromantic energy that filled every cubic inch of space around them. And he laughed. The sound wasn't mocking or cruel. It carried genuine amusement, as though he had just witnessed something delightfully entertaining. In response to that laughter, Nixthar began to blaze with light that transcended conventional description. Not the golden radiance of divine power or the silver gleam of purified mana. This was the impossible luminosity of gray made manifest, the edgeless blade becoming a conduit for forces that operated beyond the boundaries of what reality considered possible. You still don't understand, Arthur said, raising the blazing sword above his head in a grip that promised absolute finality. Let me show you what lies beyond the system's limitations. He swung. Valen's enhanced domain. His ultimate technique, his life's masterwork, the power that could rival continental threats. Split in half. Not destroyed through overwhelming force. Not countered through superior technique. Simply divided along a line of perfect separation that ran from the zenith of his necropolis to its deepest foundations, as though reality itself had been convinced that two distinct spaces could exist in the same location. The spectral armies on one side of the line continued their eternal march, while those on the other simply weren't. The obsidian towers split perfectly down their centers, their upper halves existing in one reality while their foundations remained in another. Even the throne of black bone found itself divided, half of it supporting empty air, while the other half waited for a king who could no longer reach it. But it was what Valen saw beyond his shattered domain that truly shattered his mind. The sky itself bore a line of separation that stretched from horizon to horizon, a perfect cut through the heavens that revealed the deeper truths lying beneath reality's surface. It was identical to the legendary feat recorded in history books, the moment when the martial king had split the sky itself upon reaching the level of demigod, demonstrating power that transcended mortal understanding. No, Valen whispered, his legs giving out as the full implications crashed over him like a tide of inevitability. That's the mark of Arthur Nightingale, still technically classified as quasi-radiant rank according to every measurement system in existence, lowered his sword and looked at the split sky with casual satisfaction. Now you understand, he said quietly. Consciousness fled from Valen's mind like water from a shattered vessel, his body collapsing amid the ruins of everything he had believed about power and possibility. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was that impossible line bisecting the heavens. Proof that the young man standing over him had achieved something that should have been beyond the reach of anyone in this generation. The battle was over. Arthur had won without even reaching his true peak. Chapter 8:15. Rin Ashbluff 1. What my master had shown me before his death was a strike that could cut open the sky itself. The memory flickered through my mind as I watched Valen's enhanced domain split along that perfect line, the heavens themselves bearing witness to power that transcended mortal understanding. My mastery of the sword wasn't high enough to replicate that legendary technique through pure skill alone. Not yet. However, I could achieve the same devastating result by channeling Grey through Nixthar, using the impossible power that existed between all extremes. That was the basis of the fifth movement of my Grade 6 art, a technique I had been developing since my return from the demon realm. It was a movement I could only use within my domain where the Grey power flowed freely, and one that would need significant refinement before I could execute it properly after achieving true Radiant rank. The technique was incomplete, dangerous to attempt, and cost more energy than I could safely sustain for extended periods. However, it was more than enough to defeat Valen Ashbluff. The king of the Western continent collapsed as consciousness fled from his overwhelmed mind, his shadow armor dissolving like morning mist while his legendary summons faded back into whatever realm they called home. The split sky overhead began to slowly heal itself, reality reasserting its natural order now that the Grey power was no longer actively maintaining the impossible division. I felt exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Using Grey even within my domain placed tremendous strain on my soul and mind. The power wasn't meant for beings at my current level. It was a force that belonged to entities who had transcended the normal boundaries of existence entirely. But as I stood over Valen's unconscious form, I felt something else that made all the effort worthwhile. The breaking of a spell. My enhanced senses, still heightened by soul vision and Seraphim's embrace, detected the unraveling of massive magical constructs somewhere deep within the Ashbluff royal palace. 9 circle enchantments that had been maintained for years were suddenly coming apart, their carefully woven matrices dissolving as their primary anchor. Valen's conscious will lost coherence. I whipped my head toward the eastern wing of the palace where the strongest concentration of failing magic originated. Through the walls and magical barriers I could feel something stirring. Something that had been sleeping for far too long. Rin. My Grey wings dissolved as my domain collapsed, the tremendous energy expenditure finally catching up to me as the crown of impossible light faded from my head. The Twilight realm gave way to normal reality, leaving us standing in the somewhat battered training grounds while the evening sky slowly returned to its natural color. She's free now, I said, though whether I was speaking to the unconscious Valen or simply voicing my realization aloud I wasn't entirely sure. Before I could process the full implications of what was happening, an overwhelming pressure descended upon the palace grounds like a physical weight. The air itself became thick and oppressive, charged with magical energy that made my enhanced senses scream warnings of imminent danger. Luna materialized beside me, her usual teenage appearance tense with concern. Arthur, something's wrong. That power signature. I know, I cut her off, already moving toward the palace as the pressure continued to build. Valen's containment spells are failing completely. We need to reach her before. The intricate 9-circle spell binding Rin Ashbluff finally unraveled completely, its luminous fragments scattering like fireflies in the wind. The magical backlash from such a massive enchantment collapsing sent ripples through the local mana field that would be detectable from miles away. I didn't waste time with conventional movement. Channeling what remained of my enhanced capabilities, I launched myself toward the eastern wing of the palace, covering the distance in a series of space-warping leaps that brought me to the sealed chambers in seconds. The door, reinforced with layers of protective enchantments that should have required specialized tools to breach, hung open like a mouth screaming into darkness. The magical locks had simply ceased to function when their primary binding collapsed, leaving nothing but ordinary wood and metal to guard against what lay within. I stepped through the doorway and felt my breath catch in my throat. The room was elegant despite its obvious purpose as a prison, with fine furniture and amenities that spoke to Valen and Camilla's love for their daughter, even as they had been forced to contain her. Bookshelves lined the walls while enchanted windows provided the illusion of outside views, to make the confinement more bearable. And on the bed sitting with perfect posture that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any aggressive stance was a woman. Rin Ashbluff appeared to be in her early 20s with pure black hair that fell in elegant waves around a face of porcelain perfection. Her dark eyes held depths that seemed to swallow light while her expression betrayed no emotion whatsoever. She could have been a beautiful doll crafted by master artisans save for one crucial detail. The aura surrounding her was unmistakably that of peak immortal rank. But it wasn't just the magnitude of her strength that set every instinct I possessed on high alert. There was something fundamentally wrong with the energy she projected, a wrongness that went beyond simple corruption into territory that felt actively hostile to the natural order. Dark mana and miasma poured from her in waves that made the very air tremble, the sheer weight of her presence sending involuntary shivers down my spine despite everything I had experienced. This wasn't the controlled power of a trained mage or even the raw fury of a magical beast. This was something that existed in opposition to life itself. Rin, I said quietly, keeping my voice low and non-threatening as I stepped closer to the bed. Her head turned toward me with mechanical precision, those dark eyes focusing on my face with an intensity that felt like being examined by something that viewed humans as curious specimens rather than fellow thinking beings. Human, she replied, her voice carrying the same emotional detachment as her expression. The word came out flat and analytical, as though she were categorizing me according to criteria I couldn't understand. Her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that might have been curiosity if there had been any warmth in her demeanor. Spell no more. Kill I can kill. The casual way she discussed taking life made my blood run cold. This wasn't malicious threat or angry posturing. She was simply stating a fact about her capabilities with the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather. The dark energies swirling around her intensified as she spoke, and I felt the very real possibility that she might decide to test her stated capabilities on the nearest available target. My reflexes tensed, preparing for combat, even as my rational mind insisted that fighting her would be suicide in my current condition. Jean. Luna. I called out, projecting my voice with enough force to carry throughout the palace. Jean appeared, almost instantly materializing from shadows with the kind of speed that spoke to genuine alarm at the magical disturbance we were all feeling. Dark mana coalesced around his hands as he assessed the situation, his training immediately recognizing the threat level represented by his sister's transformed state. Chains of concentrated shadow erupted from the floor, wrapping around Rin's limbs with the kind of binding force that could restrain most magical beings. The technique was perfectly executed, showing Jin's mastery over his family's traditional magic, while demonstrating his understanding of what needed to be done. Rin didn't flinch at the sudden restraint. She simply looked down at the chains with that same tilted head gesture, studying them as though they were mildly interesting decorations rather than magical bindings designed to contain her power. With a subtle flex of her arms, the kind of casual movement someone might make when stretching after a long nap, the shadow chains groaned under tremendous strain. I could see the magical constructs beginning to fracture as they encountered force far beyond their design parameters. Before the bindings could snap completely, Luna stepped forward with the calm confidence that came from millennia of experience dealing with dangerous magical entities. Sleep, she whispered, placing one delicate hand on Rin's head, while her mana flared with controlled precision. The technique Luna employed was deceptively simple in appearance but incredibly sophisticated in execution. Rather than trying to overwhelm Rin's tremendous power through brute force, she targeted the specific neural pathways responsible for consciousness, using surgical precision to induce slumber without triggering defensive responses. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Rin's dark eyes fluttered shut. Her body went limp as the forced sleep took hold, the overwhelming pressure of her aura diminishing to more manageable levels as her conscious control over her power relaxed. Jin's shadow chains dissolved as the immediate threat passed, though he remained tense and ready to act if the situation changed. Her mental strength is surprisingly weak, Luna observed with obvious relief, her voice carrying notes of professional assessment. Despite her tremendous magical power, her psychological defenses are almost non-existent. It's as though all her development focused on raw capability while ignoring protective mechanisms. She turned to me, her ancient eyes serious despite her youthful appearance. The corruption has been growing unchecked for years, creating patterns that are fundamentally incompatible with human consciousness. Her mind is fragmenting under the strain. Can it be fixed? I asked, though I suspected I already knew what needed to be done. Not from the outside, Luna confirmed with a shake of her head. The damage is too deep, too integrated with her core identity. Someone would need to enter her mindscape directly and address the corruption at its source. The risks? I continued, knowing there had to be significant dangers involved in such a technique. Considerable, Luna admitted. Mental contact with someone this unstable could result in your own consciousness being overwhelmed or corrupted. If her subconscious mind perceives you as a threat, she could trap you indefinitely within her internal landscape. I looked down at Rin's peaceful sleeping face, noting how the absence of that unsettling awareness made her appear almost normal again. Almost like the child I remembered from years ago before the corruption had begun its terrible work. Are you ready? Luna asked quietly, her mana beginning to shimmer with the complex preparations necessary for consciousness transfer. I nodded, settling into a comfortable position beside Rin's bed, while Luna's power enveloped both of us in a soft protective cocoon. The world around me dissolved into streams of light and shadow as my consciousness detached from my physical form. And with that I descended into Rin's mind. Chapter 8:16. Rin Ashbluff. 2. The world dissolved around me as I descended into Rin's mindscape, consciousness fragmenting into streams of memory and emotion that pulled me through years of carefully buried trauma. Luna's technique had worked perfectly, allowing my awareness to slip past the defensive barriers that surrounded Rin's psyche, and into the deepest chambers where her true self remained hidden. The first memory that surfaced came with crystalline clarity, as though I were experiencing it firsthand rather than observing from a distance. September 9, 2027. The sterile corridors of the Ashbluff Estate's medical wing echoed with the sound of a woman's cries, each scream cutting through the air like a blade drawn across glass. I found myself standing beside Valen Ashbluff. Not the king I had just fought, but a younger version whose stoic expression couldn't quite mask the anxiety radiating from his every movement. His fingers drummed against the hilt of his dagger in an unconscious rhythm that spoke to nerves stretched beyond their breaking point. The man who commanded armies and ruled a continent was utterly helpless in the face of his wife's suffering, reduced to pacing outside a delivery room while medical professionals handled something far beyond his ability to control. We should have used artificial wombs, his thoughts echoed in the memory space around me. Enhanced genetics, perfect development conditions, no risk to Camilla. But then the children wouldn't be able to channel mana properly. The Ashbluff bloodline demands natural birth, even if it means. Camilla's screams intensified, and I felt Valen's composure crack slightly as genuine fear bled through his royal training. The prospect of losing either his wife or children in childbirth was something no amount of political maneuvering or military strategy could address. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the cries faded into silence that felt heavier than any sound. The delivery room doors opened with a soft hiss, and a doctor emerged with the kind of carefully controlled expression that spoke to good news delivered with professional restraint. "Your Majesty," the physician said with practiced reverence, "Her Majesty has delivered safely. Please come inside." I followed Valen's memory into the pristine medical chamber where Camilla lay exhausted but radiant on the specialized bed. In her arms she cradled two bundles of silk-wrapped life, her face glowing with the kind of tired joy that only new mothers could truly understand. "Twins," Valen breathed, his voice carrying wonder that made him sound almost boyish despite his imposing presence. "A son and a daughter," Camilla confirmed, her eyes shining as she looked up at her husband. "Perfect and healthy, both of them." The memory shifted as I watched Valen approach the bed with uncharacteristic hesitancy, his powerful hands trembling slightly as he reached for the infant Camilla offered him. The sight of the Western continent's most feared ruler reduced to nervous uncertainty by something as simple as holding his newborn daughter created a stark contrast that humanized him in ways his public persona never allowed. "What shall we name them?" Camilla asked softly, her voice carrying the kind of gentle exhaustion that spoke to hours of labor finally concluded. Valen gazed down at the two children, their identical black hair and dark eyes marking them unmistakably as his offspring. For a moment his stoic mask completely dissolved, replaced by paternal love so pure it made the surrounding memory glow with warmth. "Rin and Jean," he said with quiet certainty. "Perfect," Camilla agreed, her smile widening with approval. The scene dissolved and reformed, showing me glimpses of the twins' early years. I watched Jean and Rin grow from infants into children, their personalities developing in ways that reflected their parents' influence while maintaining distinct individual characteristics. Jean showed early signs of the analytical thinking and diplomatic grace that would serve him well as heir to the throne, while Rin demonstrated a curious intelligence tempered by genuine kindness toward everyone around her. Then the memory shifted to their 5th birthday, and I felt the emotional atmosphere darken with approaching tragedy. The gift awakening ceremony was a sacred tradition in the Ashbluff family, marking the moment when latent magical abilities first manifested in their bloodline. I watched as the family gathered in a specially prepared chamber, its walls inscribed with generations of protective enchantments designed to contain any unexpected magical manifestations. Jean went first, stepping forward with the kind of quiet confidence that would define his approach to challenges throughout his life. The ceremonial appraiser, an elderly mage whose expertise in magical assessment was renowned throughout the continent, began the ritual with practiced precision. Mana swirled around the boy in patterns that spoke to powerful potential awakening within his young form. When the energy finally settled, the appraiser's face lit up with genuine excitement. "You have been blessed with the gift of Necromancer's touch," he announced with obvious pleasure. The pride that radiated from Valen was almost tangible, his satisfaction at seeing his family's traditional magic manifest in his son clear in every aspect of his posture. He placed a firm hand on Jin's head, the gesture carrying approval and promise of future training to develop this remarkable ability. Then it was Rin's turn. I felt the memory's emotional tenor shift as the 5-year-old girl stepped forward with the same quiet confidence her brother had shown. But something was different about the way Mana responded to her presence. The energy in the room grew darker, heavier, as though something fundamentally wrong was about to occur. Rin's black hair began to shimmer with an oily iridescence that spoke to forces no child should have been able to access. The appraiser leaned forward with professional interest that rapidly transformed into growing alarm as his enhanced senses detected energies that violated every natural law he understood. And then blood exploded across the chamber. The appraiser screamed as massive wounds opened across his chest, the injuries appearing instantaneously as though carved by invisible blades. He stumbled backward, clutching at torn flesh while his professional composure shattered under the reality of what was happening. Valen reacted with the speed of someone whose survival had depended on split-second decisions for decades. His mana twisted through the room's ambient energy, creating binding constructs that froze Rin in place before she could cause additional damage. "Rin?" he said carefully, his voice carrying the kind of cautious authority used to address dangerous wild animals. The child who turned toward him was not the daughter he had raised with such care and love. Rin's dark eyes had become windows into something alien and hostile, while her innocent features twisted into an expression of pure malevolence. "Kill," she hissed, her voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "Kill. Kill. Kill." The words emerged as a chant of absolute commitment to destruction, each repetition driving home the terrible truth of what the gift awakening had revealed. This was not magical corruption or temporary possession. This was Rin's fundamental nature asserting itself for the first time. "Sleep," Valen whispered, desperately pouring his will into the command with enough force to render unconscious most beings short of radiant rank. Rin's body went limp as enforced slumber claimed her, the murderous intelligence fading from her eyes as her consciousness retreated. The king turned toward the wounded appraiser with an expression that promised consequences beyond imagination if the wrong words were spoken. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had ended wars through diplomatic pressure alone. The elderly mage dropped to his knees despite his injuries, terror overriding professional dignity as he processed the implications of what he had witnessed. "Your Majesty," he stammered, blood still seeping through his fingers, "your daughter. She possesses a miasmic gift." The silence that followed was profound enough to feel like physical pressure against everyone present. Miasma, the antithesis of human magical development, the force that drove corrupted creatures to seek the destruction of all civilization. For such power to manifest in a member of the royal family represented catastrophe on a scale that threatened the stability of the entire continent. "None of you will speak of this beyond these walls," Valen said with deadly quiet that made the air itself seem to vibrate with suppressed violence. "From this moment forward, Princess Rin Ashbluff is officially dead. Anyone who suggests otherwise will discover that some fates are worse than simple execution." The memory shifted again, showing me years of desperate research and increasingly futile attempts at finding solutions. I watched Valen and Camilla work through nights that blended into days consulting ancient texts and forbidden grimoires while seeking aid from sources they would never have approached under normal circumstances. As the years passed, I watched Valen's strength diminish under the constant strain of maintaining the seals that contained his daughter's growing power. The man who had once stood as the continent's strongest ruler was slowly killing himself to prevent a catastrophe that seemed increasingly inevitable. "We can't save her," Camilla whispered during one particularly dark moment, her voice breaking with accumulated despair. "Not like this. Not with anything we've tried." "She'll surpass me soon," Valen replied, hollowly staring at the sealed door that had become his daughter's entire world. "And when she does, everything we've built will fall. Everyone we're sworn to protect will die." The memories faded, leaving me standing in a space that felt like the intersection between dream and reality. The chaotic swirl of Rin's traumatic experiences settled into something resembling a physical location. A simple room with walls that flickered between the elegant chambers of her childhood and the sterile prison of her teenage years. And there, sitting on a bed that existed in both timelines simultaneously, was Rin herself. But this wasn't the corrupted being I had encountered in the physical world. This was the core consciousness that had been buried beneath years of miasmic influence. A fragment of what she might have been if fate had been kinder. Her black hair flowed freely around shoulders that carried none of the unnatural tension I had observed earlier. Her dark eyes, unclouded by destructive impulses, held a clarity that spoke to intelligence unmarred by forced malevolence. She appeared almost serene, but the words that emerged from her lips carried weight that made the surrounding mindscape tremble. "You saw it all, didn't you?" she said, her voice melodious but edged with resignation that cut deeper than any blade. "How I'm going to kill my own family. How everything my parents sacrificed means nothing because I'm fundamentally broken." I studied her carefully, noting the subtle differences between this manifestation and the memories I had just experienced. This was Rin as she truly was, beneath the corruption. Still herself, still capable of love and rational thought, but carrying the full weight of understanding about what she represented to everyone around her. "Just kill me," she continued with a shallow smile that couldn't hide the pain behind her request. "Me being alive is the worst crime possible. Every day I continue to exist brings my family closer to destruction." "Sorry, but no," I replied with a casual shrug that treated her desperate plea as nothing more significant than a request for the time. Her expression darkened confusion and frustration bleeding through the resigned facade she had been maintaining. "I won't thank you for saving me," she said with growing intensity. "I just want to die so I won't be a burden to my family anymore. I don't feel anything except the urge to destroy. I can't exist as anything except a weapon pointed at the people I love most. Don't save me. Don't care about me. Just kill me and let this nightmare end." I met her gaze without flinching, recognizing the genuine anguish behind her words, while refusing to accept the conclusion she had reached. "You love them, don't you?" I asked simply. The question hit her like a physical blow, her carefully constructed emotional barriers cracking under the weight of absolute truth. "I do," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "How could I not love my own family? They're everything to me." "Then you want to give up on them?" I pressed, allowing steel to enter my voice. "After your father sealed you for 17 years desperately searching for any way to save you? After your mother cried herself to sleep every night knowing her daughter was suffering but unable to help? You want to throw all of that sacrifice away because the solution seems impossible?" Rin's composure cracked, further tears beginning to gather in eyes that had carried nothing but resignation moments before. "No, you don't understand," she protested desperately. "I am the problem. As long as I exist. I know exactly who you are," I interrupted with firm conviction that cut through her spiral of self-recrimination. "And I don't care about the corruption or the destructive impulses or any of the other problems everyone else sees as insurmountable." "Then you're a fool," she whispered, but the words carried hope rather than condemnation. Maybe, I agreed with a slight smile. "But I'm a fool who knows how to fix the impossible." Without waiting for her response, I stepped forward into the heart of her mindscape, my resolve unwavering despite the challenges that lay ahead. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 8:17. Rin Ashbluff. 3. I stepped through the threshold of Rin's consciousness, her spectral figure watching with hollow resignation as I passed beyond the barrier that separated her surface thoughts from the deeper truths buried within. The moment I crossed that invisible line, reality began to fracture around me like glass struck by lightning. The world twisted violently, shapes bending in ways that defied geometric logic, while light and shadow flickered in chaotic patterns that hurt to observe directly. My enhanced senses, still active even in this mental realm, struggled to process the impossible geometries surrounding me as Rin's traumatic memories bled through the fabric of her psyche. Then, with jarring suddenness, solid ground materialized beneath my feet. And with it came the stench of war. "Move! The aerial divisions are being torn apart." A commanding voice bellowed across what had become a battlefield of unprecedented scale. I looked up to see the sky alive with desperate combat. Sleek aircraft and massive aerial carriers engaged in futile battle against tendrils of pure black mana that erupted from the earth like malevolent lightning. Each explosion painted the heavens in streaks of orange and crimson, while the twisted remains of once proud war machines crashed to the ground with thunderous impacts that made the earth tremble beneath my feet. My steps were hesitant but determined as I pushed forward through the chaos, my instincts screaming warnings while my rational mind worked to process the scope of what I was witnessing. This wasn't just a battle between armies. This was annihilation on a scale that transcended conventional warfare. The ground beneath my feet was saturated with blood, dark and sticky, pooling around the corpses of soldiers whose faces remained frozen in expressions of terror and agony. Shattered weapons and torn banners littered the battlefield like the debris of civilization itself, while the air reeked of ozone, burning metal, and the iron tang of mass death. As I continued forward, understanding crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. In the novel of this world, certain individuals earned classification as calamities, beings whose very existence spelled doom for entire civilizations. The first calamity, the heavenly demon, ended the golden age of humanity. The second calamity, Caladros the vampire monarch, had consumed the eastern continent in a tide of crimson night. The third calamity, Jack Blazespout the Hellflame Emperor, had reduced the southern continent to smoldering wasteland. And now, standing at the epicenter of this apocalyptic vision, was the being who would become known as the fourth calamity. Rin Ashbluff. This wasn't memory or fantasy. This was prophecy. A glimpse of the future that would unfold if the seals containing her corruption ever failed completely. The western continent wouldn't simply fall to her power, it would be erased from existence, swept away like sand before a tsunami of pure destructive force. "Not on my watch," I muttered under my breath, clenching my fists as I pressed deeper into the heart of the vision. Near the center of the devastation, I could see military commanders desperately trying to coordinate a response that had already failed before it began. "When will reinforcements arrive?" demanded a general whose voice trembled despite the gleaming dark armor that marked him as a low, immortal rank Dark Knight. His question hung unanswered in air thick with despair because there was no reinforcement capable of addressing what they faced. I wove through the chaos of the battlefield, stepping over the bodies of soldiers who had died believing they were defending their homeland against a threat they could understand. My eyes remained fixed on the epicenter of destruction, where the source of all this devastation waited. Rin stood at the heart of the storm, her presence both magnificent and terrifying in its absolute wrongness. A semi-transparent barrier shimmered around her. Not a true domain but a construct of pure malevolent intent that served as both shield and weapon. It repelled approaching soldiers like leaves caught in a hurricane, sending grown warriors tumbling backward with their will to fight shattered before they could even reach striking distance. Unlike a proper domain, this barrier didn't imprison its victims. It simply annihilated their capacity for resistance, turning brave soldiers into broken survivors who could only flee in terror. She's absurdly powerful, I thought with growing unease, my enhanced senses cataloging capabilities that defied easy classification. This wasn't the frail girl who had been sealed away for 17 years. This was Rin transformed into the fourth calamity, her mana core burning with the intensity of low radiant rank while her combat instincts showed refinement that surpassed even Valen's decades of experience. I pressed forward through the thinning chaos, the devastation around me becoming more absolute as I approached her position. A soldier reached out desperately to stop me, fear etched across his blood-streaked face. "Wait, what are you doing?" He yelled, his hand grasping at my sleeve. "That's certain death." I brushed past his grip without breaking stride, my focus entirely on the shimmering barrier that loomed ahead. The moment my body made contact with its edge, something extraordinary happened. Parted for me like water before a blade. I stepped inside the zone of absolute destruction, feeling the oppressive weight of corrupted power pressing against my consciousness from all directions. At the center of this maelstrom of black mana stood Rin herself, her dark eyes turning toward me with interest that carried no trace of humanity. "Oh?" Her voice was soft but laced with malice that made the air itself seem to recoil. "Someone strong has come to die. How delightful. I'll kill you slowly." Black mana surged around her in waves that made reality itself seem to bend and warp, each pulse carrying enough destructive force to level city blocks. I felt a chill run down my spine despite my determination to see this through. "Apologies," I said, steadying myself as I began to channel my own power, "but I won't be killing you. Or dying here for that matter." Her corrupted mana crackled with anticipation of violence, coiling and uncoiling like a serpent preparing to strike. In response, I called upon everything I had learned during my time in the demon realm. Soul resonance flooded my system, granting me mythic body enhancement, while soul vision allowed me to perceive the true flow of her attacks. Lucent harmony synchronized my magical channels for optimal efficiency, while Seraphim's embrace wrapped me in protective energy that made my skin shine with subtle divine radiance. Then I opened my domain. Domain expansion. Throne of Eternal Twilight. The Twilight Realm burst forth around me, transforming the apocalyptic battlefield into something balanced between light and shadow, order and chaos. Unlike Rin's barrier of pure destruction, my domain radiated controlled authority. The perfect synthesis of all three aspects of magical development working in absolute harmony. Gray wings unfurled from my back, their impossible coloration speaking to power that existed between all conventional classifications. A crown of the same perfect gray materialized upon my head, neither light nor dark, but the balance point that connected all extremes. This time I chose to keep my domain's boundaries permeable. The armies beyond could witness everything that occurred within, seeing clearly how this confrontation would unfold without risking interference from desperate commanders who might try to bombard the area with artillery or magical attacks. "At least she doesn't have a proper legendary grade artifact for direct combat," I noted, observing the black heart embedded in her chest. Valen's artifact was powerful certainly, but it was designed for large-scale necromantic manipulation rather than personal dueling. Against me, its effectiveness would be significantly reduced. Light cascaded around me as my domain reached full manifestation, the gray power flowing through my being like liquid starlight. I was using everything. Every technique learned through desperate battles, every enhancement earned through impossible trials, every gift that had been granted or stolen or earned through blood and sacrifice. Mythweaver pulsed in the depths of my consciousness, ready to reshape reality according to my will. Soul resonance provided perfect awareness of every threat and opportunity. Lucent harmony balanced the chaos of combat with the serenity of absolute purpose. In my hand, Nixthar gleamed with anticipation, its edgeless blade singing with power as my perfected techniques guided every movement. This weapon had tasted the blood of marquee-level demons and carved through the fundamental forces of reality itself. I wouldn't lose here. I couldn't afford to lose. Because this wasn't about proving my strength or testing my capabilities. This was about her. About Rin Ashbluff, the girl who had been buried beneath layers of corruption and despair, waiting for someone to remember that she was worth saving. The battle for her soul was about to begin. Chapter 818. Rin Ashbluff. 4. Kill. The word pulsed through Rin's corrupted consciousness like a heartbeat made of pure malevolence, echoing through every fiber of her being with relentless, consuming intensity. It wasn't a thought. It was existence itself, as fundamental as breathing and infinitely more urgent. Her dark eyes swept across the battlefield, categorizing everything she saw not as individuals or obstacles but as targets requiring elimination. She had to kill them all. Every last human. The compulsion was absolute. Her smile was a work of art crafted from nightmares devoid of any trace of humanity, while miasma and dark mana crackled around her like twin hurricanes vying for supremacy. The miasma. True anathema to human magical development. coiled with hunger that transcended mortal understanding, while dark mana danced alongside it in perfect synchronization, amplifying her already overwhelming capabilities. Together they fed into the terrifying power of duality, her gift. Rin didn't need the meticulous training that defined conventional mages or the careful spell construction that limited normal practitioners. Her magic wasn't learned through study or practice. It was born from instinct, raw and immediate, the kind of power that made mockery of academic limitations. A spell began forming without conscious direction, manifesting as a monstrous arrow of purple energy that vibrated with the destructive potential of nine-circle magic. It radiated pure malice, making the very air tremble under the pressure of its creation, while reality bent slightly around its edges. Without hesitation, Rin released the attack, watching with predatory satisfaction as the arrow of carnage tore through space toward Arthur. Arthur's response was a single, perfectly controlled movement. Nixthar swept in a precise arc, and the devastating spell simply ceased to exist. Not deflected or absorbed, unraveled at the conceptual level, its carefully woven structure dissolving into harmless energy that dissipated like morning mist. "Kill!" Rin muttered, her voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. The word itself seemed to reshape reality around her, making the corrupted ground beneath her feet crack and split in response to her will. But before she could launch another attack, something impossible happened. Arthur's hand rested gently on her shoulder. Impossible. She was faster than this, stronger than this. Her enhanced perception should have tracked his movement, her reflexes should have intercepted any approach. Yet somehow he had simply appeared beside her, his touch carrying warmth that made the miasma recoil instinctively. Rin spun around with inhuman speed, her fist lashing out with enough force to shatter mountains. The strike was wreathed in astral energy forged from the twisted fusion of her dual nature, carrying power that could crack continental shelves. Arthur sidestepped the devastating blow with fluid grace, his hand sliding from her shoulder to her back in a gesture that somehow managed to be comforting despite the circumstances. The gray wings that sprouted from his shoulders moved with lazy confidence, their impossible coloration speaking to authorities that transcended normal magical classification. Rin's eyes narrowed as new spells began forming around her, droplets of absolute darkness that materialized in the air like fragments of the void given physical form. Each point of light-consuming shadow carried enough destructive potential to level cities, while their combined effect promised annihilation on a scale that defied comprehension. Arthur looked at the approaching devastation and simply smiled. The expression wasn't mocking or dismissive. It carried genuine warmth, as though he were watching a child struggle with a difficult but ultimately harmless task. That smile made Rin's corruption rage with fury, while something deeper within her consciousness stirred with emotions she had thought permanently buried. She spread the spell wide, letting it blanket the entire battlefield in a tidal wave of absolute destruction. This wasn't merely an attack. It was the weaponization of entropy itself, designed to unmake everything it touched on a fundamental level. Arthur raised Nixthar, and the blade's tip touched the ground with surgical precision. Fourth movement of his grade 6 art, Pond of Tranquility. In an instant, every droplet of darkness was neutralized. The space around Arthur became perfect stillness, a sphere of absolute negation that dominated the immediate area, while reality reasserted natural order within its boundaries. Rin's ultimate attack simply stopped existing, its carefully constructed malevolence unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry. "Let it all out," Arthur said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of unshakable confidence that came from facing impossible odds and emerging victorious. Space warped around him as he closed the distance between them in a single step, his hand returning to her head with gentle persistence. "I can take it. Kill." Rin snarled through gritted teeth, miasma surging as she lashed out with another devastating punch. But Arthur warped space again, his movement so fluid and absolute that her fist met nothing but empty air. She twisted her own considerable power, her capabilities as a radiant rank mage allowing her to bend spatial dimensions according to her will. Yet no matter how she tried, she couldn't detect the subtle shifts when Arthur moved. It wasn't that he was faster, it was that he operated according to different rules entirely. His throne of eternal twilight dominated the very fabric of reality within its boundaries, creating a space where his authority was absolute. Rin's immense power corrupted, though it couldn't overcome the sheer inevitability of his domain's influence. The battle continued as a dance of chaos and restraint. Arthur never raised his sword to harm her, never responded to her fury with matching violence. Instead, he embraced her with actions that defied the very nature of their surroundings. A gentle touch here, a patient presence there, an unshakable calm that refused to yield under her desperation. Rin poured everything she possessed into her attacks. Miasma fused with conventional energy to create spells of pure annihilation. Her fists struck with enough force to reshape landscapes. Raw, unbridled power flowed from her in waves that should have overwhelmed any opposition. Yet, despite her might, an absolute gap existed between them. Not born of strength alone but of purpose and will refined through trials that had forged Arthur into something beyond conventional classification. 9 circles of gray energy materialized around Arthur, as he prepared to demonstrate the technique he had developed during his time in the demon realm. The magical method he had created after absorbing Bahamut's dragon heart allowed him to weave multiple complex spell structures, simultaneously creating constructs that rivaled the greatest achievements of Archmage-level practitioners. But instead of using this overwhelming power to destroy, he channeled it into containment and redirection, turning Rin's own attacks against themselves while never allowing permanent harm to reach her. Why? Rin's voice cracked as her rational mind began to peek through the layers of corruption exhaustion, making it harder for the miasma to maintain absolute control. Why don't you just kill me? It would be so much easier. I want to save you, Arthur replied with simple honesty that cut through her despair like a blade of pure light. Why? Are you some kind of hero? She spat derision, failing to mask the tremor of desperate hope beneath her words. Arthur tilted his head slightly, his expression softening while his gray-crowned authority never wavered. A hero sacrifices one person for the world, he said with quiet conviction. I'm just a crazy bastard who'd sacrifice the world for one person. Rin froze, her mind struggling to process words that redefined everything she thought she understood about strength and purpose. What? She whispered, vulnerability bleeding through her corrupted facade. Before she could react further, Arthur moved. Not aggressively, but with the kind of deliberate care reserved for the most precious things. She lashed out instinctively, her fist arcing toward him with mountain-shattering force, but he deflected the blow with gentle precision before stepping into her space and wrapping his arms around her. He hugged her. The simple gesture carried more power than any spell, more authority than any domain technique. In that moment, surrounded by the devastation of her own making, Rin felt something she had thought lost forever. Unconditional acceptance. So I'll save you, Rin Ashbluff, Arthur whispered, his voice low and steady with unshakable promise. And I'll teach you how to love again. Rin let out a sound that was half growl and half sob, miasma erupting from her in a final desperate surge that chipped away at Arthur's protective aura. The sheer force of her anguish made his gray crown flicker while fragments of light fell like embers around them. Arthur warped space, instantly retreating just far enough to avoid being consumed while maintaining the connection between them. His breathing had grown heavier, his domain flickering ever so slightly as the sustained use of gray power pushed even his enhanced capabilities toward their limits. More? He murmured, scratching his cheek with a gesture that belied the growing strain visible in his movements. I can't keep this up indefinitely. He wasn't lying to himself. The only reason he could maintain such overwhelming superiority was because of his domain and the gray power it allowed him to access. But even that transcendent force had limitations when channeled through someone who hadn't yet reached true radiant rank. Still, he pressed on. This wasn't a battle he could afford to lose. Not for himself, but for the girl whose soul hung in the balance. Come on, Rin, Arthur called out, his voice carrying calm determination despite his obvious exhaustion. Let it all out. Every last bit of pain and rage and despair. I'll take it all. Rin snarled, her miasma swirling around her like a living entity that sought to devour everything within reach. Yet beneath the storm of corruption, her gaze wavered for the briefest moment. Her attacks continued with relentless fury, but there was hesitation now. Doubt creeping in where absolute certainty had once reigned. Something fragile and precious was fighting against the all-consuming hunger that had defined her existence for so long. Arthur smiled faintly, his gray aura burning brighter as he prepared for the final phase of their confrontation. I'll save you, he repeated, more to himself than to her. Even if it costs me everything I have. Chapter 819. Rin Ashbluff. 5. I never wanted to hurt anyone in my life. The memory surfaced unbidden as I continued my relentless assault against Arthur, each strike carrying the weight of years of accumulated anguish. I had been 3 years old when I made that promise, standing in the sunlit gardens of the Ashbluff estate with the unwavering confidence that only a child could possess. I'll never hurt anyone, I had declared to my parents, and Jean, my small fists clenched as though the gesture could bind the universe itself to honor my words. The conviction in my voice had made even my father smile, that rare expression of warmth that he reserved for moments when his children reminded him why ruling was worthwhile. My mother had knelt down to embrace me, her warmth wrapping around me like the gentlest magic. My sweet Rin, she had whispered, her voice carrying all the love a parent could hold. Father's strong hand had ruffled my hair with unexpected tenderness, his deep voice rumbling with pride and affection as he spoke. That's a noble promise, little princess. I had been loved. Completely, unconditionally, absolutely loved. As the princess of the Western continent, I had been adored not just by my family but by the people who saw in me hope for a brighter future. I had basked in that love, in the certainty that I could make the world better through compassion and strength guided by righteousness. The approaching awakening ceremony had seemed like the first step on a shining path I was destined to walk. Jean, I had said one afternoon as we played among the enchanted roses of our family's private garden, when I get my gift, I'll make sure there's no more crime in our kingdom. I'll make the world safe for everyone who can't protect themselves. Jean, always quieter and more thoughtful than his exuberant sister, had nodded with solemn certainty. I'll help you, he had replied simply, and those 3 words had filled me with such joy that I had laughed with pure delight. When the awakening ceremony finally arrived, I could barely contain my excitement. Jean had gone first, stepping forward with quiet confidence while magical energy swirled around him in patterns that spoke to powerful potential awakening within his young form. The appraiser's announcement had filled the room with pride and celebration. The gift of necromancer's touch, he had declared with obvious pleasure. The satisfaction radiating from father had been almost tangible, his approval clear in every aspect of his posture as he placed a firm hand on Jin's head. I had clapped and cheered, my heart swelling with happiness for my beloved brother and anticipation for my own moment of transformation. Then it had been my turn. I had stepped forward eagerly, my chest tight with excitement and nervous energy. The ritual had begun normally enough, magical power rushing through my small body in waves that felt like liquid starlight. At first it had been exhilarating, a flood of potential that made me feel like I could fly. But then something had gone wrong. The energy that should have been warm and welcoming turned caustic, burning through my veins like acid. Pain beyond anything my young mind could process had torn through my body, making me gasp and clutch at my chest while the world seemed to blur around me. It hurts, I had thought desperately, panic rising as the agony intensified beyond all reason. Why does it hurt so much? The room had grown darker, shadows creeping in from corners that shouldn't have existed, while a suffocating presence pressed against my consciousness. And then I had felt it. Something alien and hungry stirring within my mind, whispering words I didn't understand in voices that made my soul recoil. When I had opened my eyes, there had been blood everywhere. The appraiser had stumbled backward, clutching wounds that had appeared across his chest without warning. My father's voice had boomed through the chamber, but the words had seemed distant and distorted. Worst of all, my thoughts were no longer entirely my own. Kill. Kill them. Their threats. Kill them all. No. I had screamed silently, trying to fight the alien voice that had invaded my mind, but it had been relentless in its hunger for destruction. They fear you now. They'll try to hurt you. Protect yourself. Kill them first. Rin. Father's voice had broken through the haze of corruption, and I had felt his mana wrapping around me like iron chains. But when I had tried to speak to tell him I was sorry, my mouth had moved on its own. Kill. I had hissed, my voice warped and inhuman. Sleep, father had whispered, desperately pouring his will into the command with enough force to render unconscious most beings below radiant rank. I had collapsed to the floor as enforced slumber claimed me, the last thing I saw being my mother's tear-streaked face as she reached toward me with hands that trembled with heartbreak. When consciousness had returned, I had found myself alone in darkness. The room that became my prison had been comfortable enough. Elegant furniture, amenities, even enchanted windows that provided illusions of outdoor views. But the seals etched into every surface had made the space feel like a tomb, their constant presence a reminder that I was no longer trusted to exist freely among the people I loved. The days had blurred into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years. Father had visited regularly, at first his mana reinforcing the barriers that kept me contained while his face maintained careful neutrality. But I could see the strain in his eyes, could feel the way each renewal sapped his strength a little more. Why? I had thought bitterly during the darkest moments. Why does he keep wasting himself on me? The voice in my head had never truly left. It whispered, constantly growing stronger as I grew older, offering solutions that made my heart sick with revulsion. Kill them before they kill you. They keep you caged like an animal. End their suffering and yours. I had fought it every day, every hour, every minute. But the black mana had been patient, gnawing at my sanity like water wearing away stone. Some days the temptation to simply give in had been almost overwhelming. There had been moments when I had considered ending everything myself. I had tried once, throwing my body against the sealed walls with all the strength I could muster. The barriers had held firm, and I had crumpled to the floor in sobbing despair. Even death had been denied to me. How cruel, I had thought in the aftermath. I wanted to help people. I wanted to protect them. But the corruption had transformed me into the very thing my younger self would have sworn to fight against. I had thought of mother's warmth, of father's hidden tenderness, of Jin's quiet loyalty and love. They deserved none of the pain my existence had brought them. They deserved a daughter and sister who could stand at their side rather than a monster who had to be locked away from the world. I hadn't wanted to hurt them. I had never wanted to hurt anyone. But deep in my heart I had known the truth. Eventually the seals would fail. The black mana would consume what remained of my human consciousness, and I would destroy the very people I loved most in all the world. Now, as I fought against Arthur in this mental battlefield, those same thoughts tormented me. Every strike I threw carried the weight of that accumulated despair. Every spell I cast was powered by years of self-hatred and desperate longing for peace. Why? I gasped, my voice trembling as exhaustion finally began to overtake the corruption's fury. My mental form should have been stronger here, should have been able to regenerate endlessly, yet somehow I felt utterly drained. Arthur stood before me, wreathed in gray light, his presence impossibly steady despite the chaos I had unleashed. He wasn't fighting to kill me, even though that would have been the mercy I had begged for. No, he was doing something far more dangerous. He was refusing to give up on me. My hope? I thought, desperately, feeling that cruel emotion beginning to stir in the depths of my consciousness. Don't do this to me. Don't make me hope. Kill me, I rasped, my voice raw and broken with years of accumulated anguish. Please, just end this nightmare. But Arthur didn't respond with violence. Instead, he stepped forward with the same careful determination he had shown throughout our battle. No, 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 no. Stop. Don't come closer. Before I could retreat, his arms wrapped around me in an embrace that carried warmth beyond anything I had felt since childhood. His strength radiated through the contact, not just physical power but something far more overwhelming. It wasn't dominance or conquest. It was acceptance. I told you, he whispered, his voice low but resonant with unshakable conviction. I'll save you. The world around me began to blur as tears I hadn't known I could still shed spilled down my cheeks. The battlefield of my own making started to dissolve, the storm of black mana that had raged within me for so long finally beginning to quiet in the face of something I had thought lost forever. Unconditional love. I gasped as the last traces of the mental realm dissolved into peaceful darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of his promise. I'll save you. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to believe that salvation might actually be possible. Chapter 820. Rin Ashbluff. 6. I exhaled slowly as the battle within Rin's mindscape finally reached its conclusion, the storm of corrupted mana that had defined her existence for 17 years gradually subsiding into something approaching peace. Her mental form rested limply in my embrace, the fierce energy that had driven her toward destruction now reduced to exhausted silence. Stubborn girl, I thought with a mixture of affection and exasperation. Even when I had entered her mind with the express purpose of healing her, Rin's first instinct had been to redirect my efforts toward killing her. Not out of selfishness or cowardice but from grim resolve to protect the world from the devastation she feared she would inevitably cause. She had even attempted to manipulate our mental battle, trying to force me into delivering a killing blow that would render her brain dead while sparing everyone beyond her prison walls. It was the kind of selfless sacrifice that would have made her younger self proud, even as it broke my heart to witness. But she had underestimated both my determination and my capabilities. I hadn't come here to destroy her. I had come to save her regardless of what that salvation might cost me personally. I still have enough mana, I noted with relief, feeling the reserves of power that remained available to me. The strength I had expended during our confrontation existed only within the mental realm, sparing my physical body from the toll of extended combat. That was crucial because what came next would require every ounce of power I could muster. Closing my eyes, I called upon my third gift with careful precision. Mythweaver. The moment it activated, I felt the familiar sensation of reality becoming malleable beneath my will. Mythweaver didn't just rewrite stories or alter narratives. It could reshape fundamental truths, taking the fabric of existence and reforming it according to patterns that defied conventional understanding. And now it would rewrite Rin's very nature. I looked down at her unconscious form, noting how peaceful she appeared when freed from the constant torment of warring magical forces. Her gift of duality wasn't inherently evil. It was simply unstable, a volatile fusion of mana and miasma that no human consciousness was equipped to handle safely. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. If one gift containing both forces was too dangerous, then I would create two separate gifts that could coexist without driving their bearer toward madness. In the mental space of her consciousness, I reached out with Mythweaver's reality-altering power. The gift of duality shimmered within her core like a chaotic star, its energies swirling in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Light and shadow, creation and destruction, order and entropy, all locked in eternal conflict within the confines of a single magical framework. Gently I touched the gift structure with my enhanced perception, feeling the threads of its existence beneath my fingers. Mythweaver sang with anticipation as I began the delicate work of unraveling what had never been meant to exist in the first place. The process required surgical precision. I carefully separated the intertwined energies, pulling apart the mana from the miasma, while maintaining the essential characteristics that made each force powerful in its own right. They resisted at first, fighting to remain connected through bonds forged by years of mutual dependence, but Mythweaver's authority was absolute within the realm of possibility. Slowly, methodically, I divided duality into its component elements. The mana portion reformed itself into something radiant and stable, pulsing with controlled power that spoke to healing and protection. The miasma crystallized into a separate gift, entirely its destructive potential contained within structures that would respond to conscious will rather than mindless hunger. When the work was complete, I felt the fundamental change ripple through Rin's entire being. Where once a single unstable gift had torn her consciousness apart, now two balanced powers existed in harmony. Distinct but complementary, powerful but controlled. Rin's mental form stirred in my arms as the transformation took hold. The lines of pain and fury that had marked her features for so long began to fade, replaced by an expression of genuine peace that I hadn't seen since her childhood memories. "It's done," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely certain she could hear me in her current state. "You're free now, Rin. The war inside you is over." I opened my eyes in the physical world, blinking against the sudden transition from mental landscape to material reality. My body felt extraordinarily heavy, every muscle protesting even the slightest movement as the toll of using Mythweaver at such an intensive level finally caught up with me. Beside me, Rin began to stir. Her breathing, which had been erratic and shallow throughout her imprisonment, settled into the steady rhythm of natural sleep. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment she simply stared at me with an expression of profound confusion. "Rin?" I said softly, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat up with tentative movements as though testing her own body for the first time in years. Her hands moved to her chest, pressing against the place where her magical core resided, and I watched her eyes widen as she felt the change within herself. Then, without warning, she turned toward me and threw her arms around my neck with desperate intensity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotions too complex for simple words. "Thank you, my hero." The raw gratitude in her tone caught me completely off guard. She pulled back just enough to look at me directly, tears streaming down her face while her dark eyes shone with something I hadn't seen in any of her memories. "Genuine hope. You didn't give up on me," she continued, her voice breaking with accumulated relief. "Even when I gave up on myself. Even when I begged you to kill me. Even when everyone else would have said I was beyond saving." I smiled weakly, raising a trembling hand to ruffle her hair in the gesture I had seen her father make in happier times. "Told you I'd save you, didn't I?" The sound of approaching footsteps drew our attention as Rin's family entered the chamber. Valen moved with uncharacteristic hesitation, his usual commanding presence subdued by 17 years of guilt and desperate hope. Camilla followed close behind, her hands pressed to her mouth as tears flowed freely down her cheeks. Jean came last, his composed demeanor cracking as he saw his sister truly awake and aware for the first time since childhood. Valen was the first to reach us, his powerful frame trembling as he knelt beside the bed. For a moment he simply stared at Rin as though afraid she might disappear if he looked away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Rin, is it really you?" "Father," she replied, simply the word carrying 17 years of longing and forgiveness. Valen's composure shattered completely. The man who had ruled a continent through sheer force of will broke down as he pulled his daughter into an embrace that spoke to every sleepless night and impossible choice he had endured for her sake. Camilla joined them moments later, her arms encircling both husband and daughter, while she whispered words of love and relief that had been building in her heart for nearly 2 decades. Jean hung back for a moment, uncertainty clear in his expression, before Rin extended one hand toward him with a tearful smile. "Brother," she said, and Jin's careful control evaporated as he rushed to join the family embrace. Watching their reunion filled me with satisfaction that went beyond any victory I had achieved in physical combat. This was what made everything worthwhile. Not the power I had gained or the recognition I had earned, but the simple act of restoring what had been broken. Valen turned toward me, his face still streaked with tears, and I could see him struggling to find words adequate for what I had accomplished. "What did you do?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. How is this possible?" I leaned back against the wall, every movement requiring tremendous effort as exhaustion weighed down my limbs like lead. "Her gift," I began slowly, my words coming with difficulty. Duality was the problem. 2 opposing forces trying to exist within a single framework. It was tearing her apart from the inside. And Valen pressed, though his tone carried understanding rather than impatience. "So I split it," I explained, managing a faint smile despite my condition. 2 separate gifts now. One for mana, one for miasma. Distinct but stable. She can use both safely without them driving her toward madness." Valen's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "You rewrote the fundamental nature of her magical development." "Something like that," I confirmed, though the effort of speaking was becoming increasingly difficult. Camilla looked at me with an expression of such profound gratitude that it made my chest tighten with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for giving us our daughter back." Chapter 8:21. Rin Ashbluff. 7. I tried to wave off the gratitude with casual dismissal, but my hand barely managed to lift a few inches before falling back to my side. The toll of using Mythweaver at such an intensive level was significant, but not quite enough to render me unconscious. Just thoroughly drained in ways that went beyond simple physical fatigue. "Arthur," Valen said, his voice thick with emotion as he turned toward me, while still keeping one arm around Rin's shoulders. "I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. What you've done here, it's beyond miraculous. It's impossible made real." The king of the Western continent, the man I had fought to a standstill just hours earlier, looked at me with something approaching reverence. His usual stoic composure had been completely shattered by the return of his daughter, leaving behind only a father overwhelmed by joy and gratitude. "You don't owe me anything," I managed to say, my voice hoarse but steady. "Rin deserved to be saved. She always did." Still, Camilla interjected softly, reaching out to squeeze my hand with gentle warmth. "What you've given us is beyond price. Our family, we were broken. Incomplete. And now, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence as tears threatened to overwhelm her again. But the look in her eyes said everything that words couldn't. Hope restored, love renewed, a future that had seemed impossible suddenly stretching out before them. Jean stepped forward, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks as he processed what he had witnessed. "I always knew you could do it," he said with quiet conviction that carried the weight of absolute faith. "From the moment you made that promise years ago, I believed you would find a way." I couldn't help but laugh at that statement, the sound coming out as more of a wheeze given my current condition. "No, you didn't," I said with fond amusement, remembering the skeptical looks Jean had given me whenever I mentioned my intention to cure Rin's corruption. "You thought I was being naive at best and dangerously delusional at worst." Jin's composure cracked further as a slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he admitted with uncharacteristic sheepishness, "perhaps I had some doubts about the feasibility of your approach." "Some doubts?" I repeated with mock incredulity. "Jean, you spent half our conversations trying to convince me to focus on realistic goals instead of chasing impossible dreams." "I may have been overly cautious in my assessment of the situation," Jean conceded, his smile growing wider as the tension of the past few hours finally began to ease. "Though in my defense, what you just accomplished was objectively impossible according to every magical theory I've ever studied." "Impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet," I replied, settling back against the wall with a contented sigh. Despite my exhaustion, watching this family reunion unfold filled me with satisfaction that made every moment of strain worthwhile. Rin stirred slightly in her father's arms, consciousness slowly returning as the magical transformation completed its work within her system. Her eyes fluttered open with the careful uncertainty of someone waking from a very long dream, and for a moment she simply looked around the room as though trying to convince herself that what she was seeing was real. "Mother?" she whispered, her voice carrying wonder and disbelief in equal measure. "I'm here, sweetheart," Camila replied, immediately moving to sit on the edge of the bed, so she could stroke Rin's hair with gentle fingers. "We're all here. Father? Jean?" Rin's gaze moved between her family members', tears beginning to gather in her dark eyes as the reality of her situation finally registered. "This isn't a dream?" "No dream," Valen assured her, his own voice thick with emotion as he tightened his protective embrace. "You're awake. You're free. You're our daughter again." What followed was one of the most beautiful family reunions I had ever witnessed. 18 years of separation, guilt, and accumulated pain began to heal as the Ashbluff family rediscovered what it meant to be whole. They talked quietly among themselves, sharing memories and making tentative plans for a future none of them had dared to imagine just hours earlier. Rin's voice was soft and sometimes uncertain as she reacquainted herself with speaking to people who weren't hallucinations or products of her corrupted imagination. But with each passing minute, she seemed to grow more confident, more herself, as the reality of her freedom settled into her consciousness. I watched from my position against the wall, content to observe their happiness without intruding on what was clearly a private family moment. The exhaustion I felt was profound but oddly peaceful, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from completing something truly important. After perhaps an hour of quiet conversation and gentle reunion, Rin finally turned her attention toward me. Her expression grew serious as she carefully extracted herself from her family's protective circle and moved to sit on the edge of my chair. "Arthur," she said quietly, her voice carrying a formality that hadn't been present when speaking with her family. "I need to thank you properly." "You don't need to," I began, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Yes, I do," she said with quiet intensity. "What you did for me. What you risked. I spent 18 years believing I was beyond salvation. That I was nothing but a monster waiting to happen. And you proved that wrong." Her dark eyes, now clear of the corruption that had clouded them for so long, looked directly into mine with an intensity that spoke to absolute sincerity. "You gave me back my life," she continued, her voice beginning to tremble with emotion. "You gave me back my family. You gave me back my future. How do I even begin to repay something like that?" I studied her face for a moment, noting the genuine gratitude, mixed with uncertainty about her place in the world. Despite being freed from the corruption, she still carried the psychological scars of 18 years of isolation and self-hatred. Those wounds would take time to heal completely. "You don't repay it," I said simply. "You live it. You take the second chance you've been given and you use it to become the person you always wanted to be." "But I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered, vulnerability bleeding through her composed facade. "What if I mess this up? What if I hurt someone? What if—" "Rin," I interrupted, gently reaching out to place a hand on her shoulder with the same gesture I had used in her mindscape. "Do you know what I saw when I was fighting the corruption inside you?" She shook her head, confusion clear in her expression. "I saw someone who spent 18 years fighting against an alien influence that was trying to remake her into a weapon of mass destruction," I continued, my voice growing stronger despite my exhaustion. "Someone who held onto enough of herself to feel guilt about actions she couldn't control. Someone who was willing to die rather than risk hurting the people she loved." Rin's eyes widened as she processed my words. "The corruption didn't make you weak, Rin. It made surviving an act of incredible strength. I smiled softly as tears began to spill down her cheeks. You endured 18 years of that torment and came out the other side still capable of love, still capable of hope, still fundamentally yourself despite everything that tried to change you. I don't feel strong, she whispered, her voice breaking completely as the emotional weight of everything finally overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. The strongest people rarely do, I replied with gentle understanding. Strength isn't about feeling invincible. It's about continuing to fight even when you feel like giving up. It's about holding onto your humanity even when everything around you tries to strip it away. It's about choosing love over hatred, hope over despair, life over death. The tears were flowing freely now, but there was something different about them. Not the bitter tears of despair and self-hatred I had seen in her memories, but the cleansing tears of someone finally allowing themselves to grieve properly. You survived something that would have broken most people completely, I continued, my voice soft but certain. You kept enough of yourself intact that when salvation finally came there was still someone worth saving. That's not weakness, Rin. That's incredible strength. You really think so? She asked through her tears, vulnerability making her voice small and uncertain. I know so, I replied with absolute conviction. And you should be proud of that strength. It's yours. It always was. Rin broke down completely, then 18 years of suppressed emotion pouring out in waves that made her whole body shake. But these weren't tears of anguish or despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of someone finally allowing themselves to feel hope for the future. I simply sat there with my hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort I could while she processed everything that had happened. Behind her I could see her family watching with their own tears of joy and relief, understanding that this breakdown was necessary. A crucial step in her healing process. When the storm of emotion finally began to subside, Rin looked up at me with eyes that held something I hadn't seen in any of her memories or visions. Genuine peace. Thank you, she said again, but this time the words carried different weight. Not just gratitude for being saved, but appreciation for being reminded of her own worth. I smiled softly, feeling my own sense of completion as I watched her begin to truly understand that she deserved the second chance she had been given. You're going to be just fine, Rin Ashbluff, I said with quiet certainty. You're stronger than you know. And for the first time in 18 years, she believed it. If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions, just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.